Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. Continuing the series on the Whitlam dismissal, this video discusses the attempts to manipulate the numbers in the Senate that were made by the coalition side. This builds on my previous video about how casual Senate vacancies are filled, so watch that one for more detail. The 1974 double dissolution election resulted in a Senate comprised of 29 Labor members, 29 coalition members, 1 Liberal movement member, Steele Hall, and 1 independent, Michael Townley from Tasmania, who later rejoined the Liberal Party on the 11th of February 1975. The Democratic Labor Party, the DLP, lost all its seats in the Senate. Section 23 of the Constitution says that questions in the Senate shall be determined by a majority of votes and each senator shall have 1 vote. The President shall in all cases be entitled to a vote, and when the votes are equal, the question shall pass in the negative. So a vote of 30 all would mean a vote was defeated, whereas a vote of 31 to 29 would mean that the vote passed. Now this became crucial in relation to the supply issue and the Whitlam dismissal. Labor's attempt to manipulate the Senate numbers in the Gare affair meant that some on the coalition side became less inclined to play by the accepted rules. The opportunity for mischief first arose when the Whitlam government decided to appoint Senator Lionel Murphy to the High Court of Australia. The appointment was controversial. Murphy had been elected as a senator for New South Wales, so his seat was to be filled by a joint sitting of the New South Wales Parliament, which had a Liberal government. At that time, Section 15 of the Constitution did not specify that a casual vacancy must be filled by a person from the same political party as had endorsed the vacating senator at the previous election. But this had been the consistent practice and arguably a convention. Prior to 1949, there had been 3 occasions upon which someone from a different party had been appointed. In 1949, the Senate electoral system was changed to one of proportional representation, with the consequence that Senate outcomes would often be very close, and the choice of who filled a Senate casual vacancy could actually affect the balance of power. In 1951, when the first casual vacancy arose in a Senate seat in Western Australia after that 1949 change, the Premier sent correspondence to the Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, and the other state premiers, proposing that a consistent approach be reached, that the person appointed be from the same party as the vacating senator and be nominated by the state executive of that party. Most other premiers, including the Premier of Queensland, Vince Gare, agreed. The South Australian Premier, Tom Playford, however, thought it should be a matter for the dominant party in the state parliament to decide, and the Victorian Premier noted that he personally favoured filling a vacancy caused by the death of a senator with someone from the same party, but he added that such a procedure had not always strictly been followed in Victoria. Nonetheless, from 1951 to 1974, every casual vacancy was filled by someone from the same party as the vacating senator. Of the 25 vacancies filled, 8 were filled in states where the governing party chose a senator from the opposing party to fill the vacancy. The participants seemed to regard themselves as bound to follow this rule as a matter of fairness, arguably establishing a convention. There was, however, one interesting variation in Queensland in 1962. The casual vacancy was caused by the death of a Labor senator. Because Queensland's Parliament was unicameral, there was no dilution of government power, which ordinarily happens in a joint sitting. Whoever controlled the Legislative Assembly in Queensland therefore determined the outcome of the vote. In this case, it was the Country Liberal Party coalition that controlled the House, and it objected to the Labor Party's nominee. It insisted that Labor should give them 2 nominees so it could exercise its power of choice. Labor only nominated 1 candidate at the sitting, and the government, after objecting, adjourned the proceedings for a week. When the proceedings were later brought back on, Labor nominated an additional candidate, and while its members voted for its first candidate, it was the second candidate who was elected. This precedent became relevant later. The first controversial casual vacancy in 1975 arose due to Murphy's appointment to the High Court. The New South Wales Liberal Premier, Tom Lewis, argued that the practice or convention only applied where the seat was vacated for non-political reasons, such as death or illness or retirement. The political appointment of a senator to another office, it was argued, did not trigger the application of any convention. His underlying approach, as encapsulated by Geoffrey Saw, was that if Labor was going to stack the High Court with its supporters, then the coalition was entitled to stack the Senate. Lewis nominated Cleaver Bunton. Bunton was not a member of any political party. He had instead been Mayor of Albury and he'd served on the Executive Committee of the Local Government Association of New South Wales. The Labor opposition leader, Neville Wran, nominated Peter Westaway, who had been a Labor candidate in the previous Senate election. Wran argued that Westaway must be chosen if the long-standing convention were not to be flouted. Wran stated, however, that he wouldn't criticise Bunton, who he regarded as a minor figure in a gross political tragedy. The joint sitting on the 27th of February 1975 elected Cleaver Bunton to fill Murphy's seat by 86 votes to 70, along party lines. While Bunton opposed some Whitlam government measures, particularly those which sought to bypass local government in favour of regions, Bunton supported the Whitlam government on the passage of supply. Hence, his appointment to fill the casual vacancy actually made no difference to the supply crisis. It was the next casual vacancy that proved to be critical to that. When the Labor Senator, Bert Milliner from Queensland, died on the 30th of June 1975, this put the power of filling the casual vacancy into the hands of the Country Party Premier, Joe Bjelke-Petersen. He objected to Labor's nominee, Mal Colston. Bjelke-Petersen insisted that the Labor Party should instead nominate 3 candidates, harking back to the 1962 precedent, although then it was only required that there be 2. Parliament was adjourned to allow Labor to reconsider its position. But this time, the Labor Party refused and it stuck with Colston. This ended up having dire consequences for the Whitlam government, as it gave the opposition in the Senate the crucial numbers to defer supply. Labor's loyalty to Colston precipitated the downfall of the Whitlam government, yet Colston did not show the same loyalty in return, later defecting from the Labor Party in order to become the Deputy President of the Senate. But back to 1975, as the Labor Party would only nominate 1 candidate, Bjelke-Petersen then invited nominations from anyone else who was a financial member of the Labor Party. Albert Field applied. He worked as a French polisher in the Public Works Department. While a strong supporter of Labor, Field was deeply opposed to the Whitlam government. He was therefore Bjelke-Petersen's perfect candidate. On the 3rd of September 1975, the Queensland Premier nominated Field to fill the casual vacancy. Field was immediately expelled from the Labor Party for allowing himself to be nominated. In the vote on his appointment, it's notable that some Liberal members objected and voted with Labor for the Labor nominee. But Field was still chosen by a majority vote of 50 to 26. He described himself as independent Labor. When Field was sworn in on the 9th of September, all the Labor members, except for the Labor leader in the Senate, walked out. Shortly after being sworn in, Field actually asked a question during question time, but that was his one and only contribution, apart from voting in a couple of divisions. The validity of his appointment was challenged under the Common Informers Parliamentary Disqualifications Act 1975. This meant that he was vulnerable to pay a fine of $200 per day that he sat if he was disqualified. It was argued that even though he'd resigned from the Queensland Public Service before he accepted the appointment, there was a 3-week notice period for resignations and that hadn't been satisfied. It was argued that because of this, he held an office of profit under the Crown when he was appointed as a senator and was therefore disqualified under Section 44 of the Constitution. Field therefore took leave of absence from the Senate for the duration of the proceedings against him, and he never sat again due to the intervention of the 1975 double dissolution election following the dismissal of the Whitlam government. Field did stand for the Senate at that double dissolution election, and he secured 2,309 primary votes, but he wasn't elected, placing 15th in a field of 40 candidates. Colston, however, was elected. What was the impact of these manoeuvres on the Senate in 1975? Labor started with 29 senators. It lost 2 with the casual vacancies of Murphy and Milliner, taking it down to 27. But Bunton, who replaced Murphy, voted with Labor on supply anyway. The independent Steele Hall also voted with Labor on supply. That brought Labor back to 29 votes on the supply issue. The problem, however, was Field. If Milliner had lived or been replaced by an official Labor nominee, Labor would have had 30 votes on the floor on the supply issue, with the opposition also having 30 votes. According to those Senate rules, a tied vote means that the vote fails. This meant that Labor would still not have been able to secure a positive vote to pass supply. However, a tie of 30 all would have also prevented the opposition from securing the positive votes necessary to defer voting on the supply bills. That would have meant that supply would have had to be either passed or defeated in the Senate. If it was defeated, this would cut off the ability of the coalition in the Senate to control whether or when supply passed. As the passage of supply was critical to the dismissal of the Whitlam government and its replacement with a coalition government that could achieve supply, this could only work if the opposition had the numbers to pass a positive resolution to defer voting on the supply bills until the crisis point was reached. Public servants in the Prime Minister's Department and the Attorney General's Department had realised this possibility some months earlier and proposed inserting a clause in the supply bills that required them to be returned to the House of Representatives for its approval before they could be sent to the Governor-General for royal assent. Whitlam, however, decided not to pursue that option. If he had, that would have meant that Fraser was not able to achieve supply, and it would have given the whip hand to Whitlam with his majority in the lower house. It was another fatal error. In the absence of such a provision, Field's appointment made the critical difference. Even though Field was on leave during the crucial votes on deferring supply, and he didn't vote on the issue at all, his absence meant that the coalition had 30 votes to Labor's 29. This was enough to defer the passage of supply, and for Fraser then to satisfy the condition on his appointment as Prime Minister, which was to secure the passage of supply before requesting a double dissolution election. Thank you once again for watching the Constitutional Clarion. I hope you learnt something, and I look forward to seeing you again next time to explore the Loans Council affair and the role of the Executive Council. See you then. Goodbye.